Go ahead, call your assistant. The flight attendant smirked, looming over the passenger. She wanted a show, and she got one. But when the captain emerged white-faced, the laughter died instantly. He didn't call an assistant. He called the cockpit. One sentence later, the most powerful person in the sky wasn't the pilot. It was the man she just insulted. The story's just getting started, and you don't want to miss a moment. Subscribe now and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from. Lauren Sterling didn't just walk the aisle of the cabin, she policed it. In her years with Aurora Executive Aviation, she had learned that luxury wasn't just about the champagne or the legroom. It was about the strict maintenance of an invisible social contract. She believed she had a sixth sense for who truly belonged in a seat that cost more than a mid-sized sedan and who was merely a guest of a guest, riding on someone else's dime. When her eyes landed on Martin's Langley, her internal alarm system went off immediately. He was too still, too quiet, and far too focused on a phone call that should have ended the moment he stepped over the threshold of the aircraft. She approached his seat, not with the practiced warmth of a service professional, but with the cold efficiency of someone enforcing a decree. "Sir, phones need to be off immediately," she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to signal to the surrounding passengers that a correction was being issued. She didn't wait for a response before hovering, her shadow falling across his lap. Martins didn't flinch. He didn't even look up at first, merely raising a single finger to signal he needed a moment to finish his sentence. To Lauren, this wasn't just a request for time. It was an act of defiance. "I'll be done in a moment," Martin said, his voice low and level. He wasn't whispering, but he wasn't performing for the cabin either. Lauren's jaw set. She could feel the eyes of the real passengers, the silver-haired regulars and the high-profile investors, shifting toward the source of the friction. She decided right then that this was the moment to establish the rule of authority. If she let this one man ignore the safety protocols and the hierarchy of the cabin, she would lose the silent respect of everyone else on board. She stepped closer, invading his personal space until she was looking down at the top of his head. "No, sir, that's not how this works," she said, raising her volume so it cut through the hum of the ventilation. "This is a private charter flight. Everyone here follows the rules, regardless of who they think they are." Martins finally lowered the phone, his expression unreadable. He didn't look angry. He looked like he was observing a curious specimen. "I understand," he replied quietly. "Just give me a second." The second was not granted. Lauren's irritation had surged into a sharp, focused hostility. She scanned him, his lack of a visible watch, the way he sat without the nervous energy of the wealthy, and she reached a conclusion that felt like a fact. "Frankly, I don't even know how you got seated up here," she said, the words landing like a physical weight in the silent cabin. "This section is for our priority members." She crossed her arms, anchoring herself in the aisle, making it clear that the plane would not move, and his life would not proceed, until he submitted to her version of the world. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was the gatekeeper of a club he hadn't been invited to join. "If you think calling someone is going to fix this," she added with a mocking, short laugh that invited the other passengers to join in her disdain, "go ahead, call whoever you want." She stood back, waiting for him to crumble under the collective gaze of the elite, confident that her authority was absolute. The cabin was so quiet that the faint whistle of the air conditioning felt like a roar. Howard Whitaker, who had spent 30 years navigating hostile takeovers and aggressive boardrooms, didn't look away from his tablet, but he had stopped scrolling. He was a man who understood the mechanics of power, and he recognized that what he was witnessing wasn't a safety briefing. It was an execution of dignity. Across the aisle, Beatrice Holloway sat perfectly still. She dealt in rare stones and high-stakes clients. She knew that in this world, silence was a currency. To speak up for the man in the charcoal suit was to risk being associated with whatever mistake had placed him there. Lauren stood in the center of the aisle, her posture rigid, basking in the compliance of the other passengers. Their refusal to intervene was her validation. She looked at Howard, then at Beatrice, seeking a silent nod of agreement, and she found it in their averted eyes. In this environment, the elite didn't make scenes. They let the staff handle the friction, so they could remain clean. The collective silence acted as a pressurized seal, locking Martin's Langley into a role he hadn't asked for, the interloper. Martin scanned the faces around him. He saw the way Howard's jaw tightened, not in defense of him, but in annoyance that his morning peace had been disturbed by a problem. He saw Beatrice adjust her silk scarf, a small, nervous gesture that signaled her desire for the unpleasantness to simply vanish. None of these people, who considered themselves leaders of industry, were willing to challenge a flight attendant's blatant overreach if it meant sticking their necks out for a stranger who didn't look the part. The social hierarchy was being enforced not just by Lauren's words, but by the passengers' indifference. It was a cold, unspoken agreement. If you don't belong, you are invisible until you are removed. Martins felt the weight of that exclusion. He wasn't just fighting a rude employee. He was staring down a room full of people who had already decided his value was zero based on a 3-minute interaction. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice to match Lauren's. He simply looked at the phone in his hand, then back at the faces of the people who would soon be his clients, his partners, or his employees. He realized that the silence in the cabin wasn't just about him. It was a revelation of their character. Lauren took his lack of a retort as a victory. She leaned in one last time, her voice a sharp whisper that didn't care who heard. "We're done here. Switch it off, or I'm calling security to have you escorted off before the doors close." Martins didn't look at her. He looked at the cabin one last time, acknowledging the silent witnesses. Then he spoke into the phone. "I think you should come out here for a moment." Lauren's smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a weapon meant to finalize the man's embarrassment. She had seen this kind of bluff a dozen times before. Passengers who felt slighted often reached for their phones to call a travel agent, a lawyer, or a spouse, hoping to conjure up some phantom authority to scare the crew. It never worked. The rules of the sky belonged to the crew, and in her mind, she was the highest law in this cabin. "You heard me," she said, leaning back and gesturing toward his phone with a flick of her wrist. "Go ahead. Call whoever you want. Call the CEO if you have his number. I'm sure he'd love to hear why you're delaying a multimillion-dollar flight because you can't follow a simple instruction." She turned slightly toward the other passengers, inviting them into the joke. A few people looked away, but the tension was so thick it felt like the air had left the room. Lauren felt a surge of adrenaline. She was winning. She had successfully labeled this man as an intruder, a fake, a nuisance. By inviting him to make the call, she was publicly betting that he was a nobody. Martin's Langley didn't look flustered. He didn't fumble with his phone or look for an escape. He simply brought the device back to his ear. The calm in his eyes was what should have warned her, but Lauren was too deep in her own performance to see it. "Yes," Martin said into the line, his voice cutting through the silence. "I think you should come out here for a moment. There's a misunderstanding regarding the cabin protocols and who is authorized to be here." Lauren let out a sharp, dry laugh. "Oh, the drama. Who are you talking to? Your assistant? Your therapist?" She checked her watch, her face hardening again. "You have 30 seconds to put that away, or I am calling the ground lead to have you removed. I don't care who you think you're talking to. On this plane, my word is the only one that matters." She stood her ground, blocking the aisle, her hand already reaching for the interphone on the bulkhead. She was convinced he was talking to thin air, playing a desperate game of pretend to save face in front of the wealthy passengers. She was so focused on the man in the seat that she didn't notice the quiet click of the cockpit door latch behind her. She didn't see the light from the flight deck spill into the galley. "I told you," Lauren said, her voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "Nobody is coming to save your seat." Then she heard the footsteps, heavy, polished, and purposeful, approaching from behind. Lauren watched the man's face, waiting for the crack, the moment of realization that his bluff had failed. She had spent years internalizing a specific map of the world. In her map, power looked like Howard Whitaker's expensive dental work and sounded like Beatrice Holloway's clipped, transatlantic accent. It didn't look like this man. He was too calm, too still, and he didn't carry the frantic, "Do you know who I am?" energy that usually defined the nouveau riche. Because he didn't fit her mental folder for owner of the world, she had categorized him as intruder. This was the trap of categorical bias. Lauren had convinced herself that she was protecting the integrity of the cabin, but she was really just enforcing a stereotype. She assumed that because he didn't perform wealth in a way she recognized, he didn't possess it. It was a common mistake made by people who spent too much time around the edges of power. They began to think they owned the gate. She looked at him and saw a man who should be in coach, or perhaps working on the ground crew, but certainly not sitting in the seat of a primary stakeholder. The passengers behind her were guilty of the same calculation. They had watched her treat a human being with open contempt and remained silent because, on some level, they agreed with her assessment. If he were one of them, they would have stepped in. But because he was an unknown variable, he was expendable. Their silence was a collective vote that his dignity was worth less than the comfort of their flight. Martin's didn't look like he was waiting for a savior. He looked like a man who had seen this exact pattern play out 1,000 times in different boardrooms and cities. He knew that people like Lauren didn't see people. They saw labels. And when the label didn't match the luggage, they attacked. "You're making a lot of assumptions based on a suit and a phone call, Lauren," Martin said. His voice wasn't an attack. It was a cold observation. "I'm making an assumption based on my job," she snapped back, her confidence wavering for the first time as the sound of the cockpit door grew louder. "And my job is to make sure this cabin stays exclusive for the people who actually pay for it." She was so certain that exclusivity was a shield. She believed that by being the one who decided who was in, she was somehow in herself. She didn't realize that in the world of true power, the people who actually own the room don't need to tell anyone they're there. They just are. And as the footsteps stopped directly behind her, the categorical map Lauren had used to navigate her entire career began to catch fire. The latch clicked with a heavy, metallic finality that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Lauren didn't move. She remained planted in the aisle, her hand still hovering near the interphone, her face locked in a mask of indignant triumph. She was so certain of the outcome that she didn't even turn around immediately. She expected a junior flight officer or a confused navigator to poke their head out to ask about the noise. Instead, Captain Douglas Carver stepped into the galley. Carver was a legend at Aurora, a man who had flown heads of state and tech giants for 3 decades. He had a presence that commanded immediate, reflexive silence. When he walked into a room, the atmosphere changed, not because of his rank, but because of the unwavering gravity he carried. Lauren turned, her expression softening into a professional, albeit strained smile. "Captain, I'm so sorry for the disturbance," she began, her voice regaining its polished lilt. "We have a passenger here who is refusing to cooperate with safety protocols. I was just about to have him." She stopped. The words died in her throat because Carver wasn't looking at her. He wasn't even acknowledging her presence. His eyes were fixed on the man in the charcoal suit. And for the first time in her 10 years of service, Lauren saw her captain look genuinely rattled. Carver took 2 long strides past Lauren, brushing off her outstretched hand as if she were a piece of stray luggage. The passengers in the front row, including Howard Whitaker, leaned forward. The air in the cabin shifted from a state of stagnant tension to one of electric shock. "Mr. Langley?" Carver said. His voice wasn't just loud. It was clear, carrying a level of deference that Lauren had never heard him use with anyone, not even the billionaire board members who usually chartered this tail number. "I had no idea you were joining us today, sir. My apologies. I wasn't notified of a change in the manifest." Martin's Langley stood up. The height Lauren had tried to use against him now felt like a physical wall. He didn't look like a man who had just been bullied. He looked like a man who had been waiting for the adults to enter the room. "It was a last-minute decision, Doug," Martin said easily. He tucked his phone into his pocket. The casual use of the captain's first name hit Lauren like a physical blow. "I wanted to see how the operations were running from the passenger's perspective. It's been enlightening." The cabin went dead silent. The sound of a pen dropping 3 rows back would have sounded like a gunshot. Lauren's hand slowly dropped from the bulkhead. The blood had drained from her face so completely that her skin looked translucent under the overhead lights. She looked at the captain, then at Martin's, then back at the captain, her mind frantically trying to reconcile the intruder she had just mocked with the man her superior was currently treating like royalty. Carver turned to the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the wealthy passengers who had sat by in silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming with a new, sharp authority. "Before we depart, I'd like to officially welcome the new majority owner of Aurora Executive Aviation." The shift was instantaneous. The silence wasn't just broken. It was shattered by a collective, sharp intake of breath. The hierarchy hadn't just changed. It had been inverted. The sound of the cockpit door clicking shut behind Captain Carver was the only noise for several seconds. Lauren stood frozen, her hand still half raised toward the interphone, as if she could still call for a world that no longer existed. Captain Carver didn't wait for her to move. He stepped past her with the ease of a man who had walked this aisle 10,000 times, but his focus was entirely on Martins Langley. "Mr. Langley," Carver said, his voice dropping into a register of genuine, unforced respect. He didn't just offer a polite nod. He extended his hand with a firm, deliberate motion. "I had no idea you were joining us today. My manifest was marked for a standard executive transport, not a principal inspection." Martins took the captain's hand. The handshake was brief and professional, the kind of gesture that happens between two men who understand exactly how a machine is supposed to run. The physical contact seemed to ground the reality of the situation for everyone watching. This wasn't a mistake or a prank. The man Lauren had tried to cast out was the man who signed the captain's paychecks. "It was a last-minute decision, Doug," Martin said. He remained standing, his height now an undeniable symbol of his position. "I wanted to see how the service looked from the other side of the curtain. I didn't want a red carpet. I wanted to see the standard procedure." Howard Whitaker, the hedge fund partner, suddenly found a reason to look up from his tablet. His expression shifted from bored annoyance to a sharp, calculating interest. He knew that Aurora Executive Aviation had been in the middle of a massive, quiet buyout, but he hadn't expected the face of that buyout to be sitting 3 feet away in a charcoal suit he had initially dismissed as average. Beatrice Holloway, the jeweler, lowered her glass, her eyes darting between Martin's and the pale, trembling flight attendant. Lauren felt the air in the cabin grow heavy. The handshake was the final nail in the coffin of her assumptions. She had spent the last 10 minutes treating the owner of the company like a trespasser, and she had done it with an audience of his most important clients. She tried to speak, to offer some kind of frantic correction, but her throat was dry. Captain Carver turned slightly toward the cabin, his hand still gesturing toward Martin's. "I apologize for the delay, everyone. We'll be underway shortly, but I wanted to personally welcome the new majority owner of Aurora. Mr. Langley took control of the firm as of 6 o'clock this morning." The revelation rippled through the seats. The silence of the elite was replaced by a low, stunned murmur. People who had ignored Martin seconds ago were now adjusting their ties and smoothing their hair, preparing for the inevitable moment they would have to introduce themselves. Martins didn't look at them yet. He kept his eyes on Carver, though his peripheral vision never left Lauren. The power in the room hadn't just shifted. It had completely recalibrated. The man who had been told he didn't belong was now the only person in the cabin who truly did. The announcement didn't come with fanfare or a drum roll. It was delivered with the flat, professional certainty of a flight plan. Captain Carver stood in the center of the aisle, his presence acting as a physical anchor that forced every passenger to face forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carver said, his voice projecting to the back of the cabin, "I've just received confirmation from our operations center. As of the opening of the markets this morning, the acquisition of Aurora Executive Aviation is complete. I would like to introduce you to our new majority owner and chairman, Mr. Martins Langley." The word owner hit the cabin like a pressure change. Lauren Sterling, who had been leaning against the galley wall for support, felt her knees weaken. She had spent 10 years climbing the ranks of this company, priding herself on knowing every face that mattered. But she had been looking at the wrong map. She had seen a man who didn't demand attention and assumed he didn't deserve it. Now, the realization that she had publicly berated the man who held her career in his hands was making it difficult for her to breathe. Martins didn't take the opportunity to gloat. He simply nodded to the captain and then turned his gaze toward the passengers. Howard Whitaker, the hedge fund partner who had ignored the confrontation earlier, was now the first to unbuckle his seatbelt. He stood up, reaching across the aisle with a practiced, opportunistic smile. "Mr. Langley, Howard Whitaker. I'd heard rumors of a restructuring. but I didn't realize we'd be flying with the man himself. Welcome aboard. Martin shook the man's hand, but his expression remained neutral. He saw the shift in the room for what it was. Not a sudden realization of his humanity, but a sudden calculation of his value. The passengers who had been complicit in his humiliation through their silence were now scrambling to be his best friend. Beatrice Holloway adjusted her jewelry and leaned in, waiting for her turn to offer a congratulatory remark, her previous disdain replaced by a look of forced admiration. "Thank you, Howard," Martin said, his voice calm and carrying through the cabin. "I decided to fly today because I wanted to see exactly what our clients experience. I wanted to see how we treat people when we think nobody is watching." He turned his head slowly toward Lauren. She was standing perfectly still, her face a mask of pale terror. The mockery she had displayed minutes ago, the laughter, the call whoever you want sneer, had vanished, replaced by the hollow stare of someone who knows they've made an irreversible mistake. The entire cabin was now watching her, but the power dynamic had inverted. They weren't looking at her as an authority figure enforcing the rules. They were looking at her as a liability that was about to be removed. Captain Carver looked from Martins to Lauren, sensing the history of the last 10 minutes in the heavy silence. "Is there a problem, sir?" Carver asked, his tone indicating he was ready to follow whatever directive the new owner gave. Martins looked at Lauren for a long beat. The new majority wasn't just a title on a piece of paper. It was the reality of who owned the air they were currently breathing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The captain is right," Martin said, his eyes never leaving Lauren's. "We have a few things to settle before we take off." Martins Langley didn't look like a man about to deliver a sentence. He looked like a man who had just finished a very boring meeting. He turned away from the cockpit and let his gaze drift across the cabin, meeting the eyes of the passengers who had spent the last 20 minutes pretending he wasn't there. The air was thick with a new kind of desperation, the kind that comes when people realize they've backed the wrong side of a fight. "Captain," Martin said, his voice easily carrying over the low hum of the idling engines, "we've had a bit of a rough start today. I think it's important we set the right tone for where this company is going." Lauren stood frozen, her fingers twitching against her uniform. She was waiting for the words, "You're fired." It was what she would have done in his position. It was the only outcome that made sense in the world she lived in. "First," Martins continued, "I want to thank our passengers for their patience. To show our appreciation for your loyalty to Aurora, I'm authorizing a complimentary lifetime membership to our executive charter program for everyone in this cabin today." A wave of stunned murmurs broke the tension. Howard Whitaker actually sat back, a look of disbelief crossing his face. A lifetime membership was worth tens of thousands of dollars in waived fees and priority routing. It was a massive gesture of goodwill, one that instantly turned the hostile atmosphere into one of celebration. People who had been ready to walk off the plane were now smiling, nodding toward Martins as if they had always been on his team. Then Martins turned his attention back to Lauren. The smile in the cabin faltered as everyone waited for the hammer to drop. "And Lauren," he said, his tone remains conversational, almost gentle, "since you were so concerned about the exclusivity of this cabin and who truly belongs here, I have a special assignment for you." Lauren swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir. You won't be performing your usual duties on this flight," Martin said. "Instead, I want you to spend the next 6 hours personally preparing and delivering the membership welcome packets to every person in this cabin. You will sit with them, learn their names, and explain exactly why they are valued members of this community." He paused, letting the weight of the task sink in. It wasn't a firing. It was a forced immersion in the humility she had lacked. She would have to look every person she had just performed for in the eye, knowing they had seen her at her worst. "I want you to understand that service isn't about deciding who is worthy," Martins added. "It's about making sure everyone feels like they are. You can start with Mr. Whitaker." Lauren nodded slowly, her face burning with a different kind of heat. It wasn't the heat of anger, but the cold realization of a lesson learned too late. She moved toward the galley to begin, her walk no longer a strut of authority, but the steady, careful pace of someone who finally understood their place in the sky. The wheels tucked into the belly of the jet with a mechanical thud, and for the first time in an hour, The cabin was actually quiet. There was no more shouting, no more mocking laughter, and no more forced silence. Lauren was at the back of the plane, methodically assembling the membership folders Martins had requested. Every time she stepped into the aisle to deliver one, she had to look a passenger in the eye. People who had watched her lose her composure, her professionalism, and her dignity in one fell swoop. Martins Langley sat by the window, watching the New York skyline shrink into a grid of gray and green. He wasn't hovering over her, and he wasn't checking her work. He didn't have to. The weight of the task was doing the work for him. Every "thank you, Lauren," she received from a passenger felt like a reminder of the person she had chosen to be only an hour before. She was learning that the hardest part of power isn't losing it. It's being forced to face the people you mistreated once the playing field is leveled. Up in the cockpit, Captain Carver maintained a steady climb. He had seen plenty of important people come and go, but he knew today was different. The culture of Aurora was changing in real time. The message had been sent without a single termination or a HR memo. Respect wasn't a commodity reserved for those with the right zip code or the right suit. It was the baseline. As the jet leveled off at 30,000 feet, Howard Whitaker leaned across the aisle toward Martins. "You handled that with more restraint than most would have, Martins. Most guys in your shoes would have left her on the tarmac." Martins didn't turn away from the window immediately. When he did, his expression was thoughtful, devoid of the coldness he'd shown earlier. "Firing her would have just made her angry," he said quietly. "Giving her the chance to actually serve the people she was trying to impress. That makes her better, and I need a company that's better." The flight continued toward Zurich, the hum of the engines the only constant. Lauren finished the last of the packets and stood at the front of the cabin, waiting for further instructions. She looked exhausted, but the sharp, judgmental edge in her eyes had been replaced by something resembling humility. She realized that her mistake hadn't been a breach of protocol. It was a breach of character. The truth that hung in the cabin as they crossed the Atlantic was one that every passenger and every crew member would carry long after they landed. Status is a shadow that changes with the light. The person you ignore in the lobby, the passenger you dismiss because they don't look the part, or the stranger you treat as invisible might just be the person who holds the keys to your next 10 years. In the end, the only safe way to navigate the world is to assume that everyone you meet is important. Because on this flight, as in life, the person you underestimate today is almost certainly the one who will hold your future tomorrow.